So last time we talked about budget constraints. Now what we need is a way to encapsulate the consumer's preferences. In order to do that, we're going to use the concept of an indifference curve. An indifference curve is all of the combinations of goods and services that provide the same level of total utility. And why do we care about what this is? It's really important because previously we only considered what a person could afford. Now we want to consider what is it that a person likes. And we need that concept of utility. And in order to do that, we're going to use the indifference curve. So let's take a look at what one looks like. So we want to include this idea of an indifference curve. So we still have Pop-Tarts here, and we still have granola here. And the big question for us then is, how do we, in this model, include our preferences? So what we need is some way to think about the granola and Pop-Tarts and the benefit that you're receiving. And we need two big concepts here. The first is this idea of total utility. This is the benefit that you're receiving from consuming the goods and services across everything that you consume. Well, in this example, that means all of the granola and all of the Pop-Tarts that you're consuming, that's your total utility. And then compare that with, say, marginal utility. And marginal utility is the idea that every time you change what you're consuming, you're gaining some additional utility. So if you already have, say, 2 ounces of granola and a Pop-Tart, and you consume another Pop-Tart, then you gain a little bit more utility. That's the marginal utility. And the marginal utility is really the change in the total utility that comes from some additional quantity. So what we could see then here, that is our marginal utility. Well, why do we spend some time talking about total utility and marginal utility? The purpose of or the goal of a consumer is to maximize total utility. However, that's a really big process and a really complicated process. If we were really to think about it just in total utility, what we'd need to do is consider every possible combination of all goods that you could consume, calculate the total utility, and then say which one of those is best. And that's a really difficult proposition. So instead, what we often do is use marginal analysis. We instead think about where is it that you currently are? What's your current situation? And then from there, you can make a change. You can say, buy an additional ounce of granola or buy an additional Pop-Tart. And we want to think about then, from the margin, which one of those decisions is best. Well, what we have then is a way to consider this choice between granola and Pop-Tarts. And so one thing that we need to do is think about how do we spend that income that's available to us. If you remember, we said the consumer has an income of $10, the price of granola is $1, and the price of a Pop-Tart is $2. And so if we only consider the utility that we're deriving from, say, granola and Pop-Tarts, there's a problem. And the problem is that they have different prices. So a Pop-Tart costs twice as much. And so it's not really fair, and it's not accurate, to just say, how much utility do I gain from a Pop-Tart? What I really need to do is consider, as I spend money on Pop-Tarts, I'm spending $2. As I spend money on granola, I'm spending $1. So let's take a look at utility for granola and Pop-Tarts, and then consider how should a consumer spend their money. Okay, so marginal utility then is the benefit that we derive from an additional unit of a good or a service. Let's take a look at our example of granola and Pop-Tarts. And as we look at the chart, what we see is that we have total utility from, say, 1 ounce of granola is 100 units of utility. The utility from 1 Pop-Tart is 170 units of utility. Now, as we mentioned before, we really don't want to look at just total utility, we want marginal utility. And we can see then that as we go from, say, 0 to 1 units of granola, the utility changes by 100. As we go from 1 to 2, total utility changes by 90. And then as we go from 2 to 3, total utility now changes by 80. We can see a similar trend here with Pop-Tarts. As we go from 0 to 1, it's 170. From 1 to 2, it's the difference from 170 to 320, and so here we have 150. And as we go from 320 to 440, we have 120. Now, as we mentioned before, the big problem is a Pop-Tart doesn't cost the same as granola. So if you were to just look at this and say, okay, well, where should I spend my money? It really looks like Pop-Tarts are giving us a lot more utility. And they are, but they also cost a lot more. So one thing that we need to do here is consider not just the marginal utility, but the price of the product as well. And in order to do that, we're going to take the marginal utility divided by its price. And so all of these values then, we really want to divide by 2. So as we talk about 170 then here, we need this to be sort of 85. As we talk about the change of 150, this should be 75. And as we talk about the change of 120, this should be 60. So what we see now is, what is this 85? What is this 75? What is this 60? Well, this is the benefit that a person's receiving, but it's the additional benefit they get by spending $1 on Pop-Tarts. So if we go from, say, spending no money on Pop-Tarts, we're up here at 0, and then we spend $1, we're really getting what? Half of one of these units. So we're getting half of that 170, or 85. The big question then is, how do we decide what to buy? Well, the easiest way is to just say, what's that benefit I get from the first $1? Well, where should I spend it? Well, I can spend it over here under granola, and for that first $1, I get 100 units of utility. Or I can spend it over here under a Pop-Tart, and I can get 85 units of utility. Well, 100's bigger than 85, so let's buy the first unit of granola. I'm just going to label that G1 so that we know our first $1 is spent on granola. Okay, now that we've done that, we know that this first unit is purchased. Now the relevant choice for us is still that first Pop-Tart at 85 for half a Pop-Tart, or the second ounce of granola at 90. So we want that second ounce of granola. That third $1 that we spend, now you'll notice what's changed. We spent $2 over here. Now it's this third $1 spent on granola, which is 80, or the first $1 spent on a Pop-Tart, which is 85. So I'm going to label this as just half of a Pop-Tart. The fourth choice, so you'll notice that's really only half of this. The fourth choice is exactly the same. It's sort of this and this. So what we want to do then is now buy the second half of that Pop-Tart. As we continue this process down, all we have to do is every time we make a decision to spend $1, spend it where marginal utility per $1 spent is the highest. And as we follow through this process, what you'll end up finding is that you'll maximize your total utility just by deciding on the margin.